Hello, I'm Carmel Michael, and this is Hyacinth Podcast, The Interviews. This is a little bonus where I get to share some of the wonderful conversations I have that I can't fit into my regular episodes. If you've listened before, you know that Hyacinth Podcast is very carefully crafted, sort of put together the way I would write a song or a story. So a lot gets left on the cutting room floor, as they say. I'd like to start sharing more of that with you, because sometimes I have to leave out really great conversations about important stuff. So if you enjoy this interview, please be sure to subscribe to Hyacinth Podcast on your favorite app and check out my regular curated episodes, which are an experience all their own. Today I'm sharing the extended interview with Dr. Kathlyn Conway, a psychotherapist and writer from New York. We heard from Dr. Conway in episode 2 on falconry and trauma. There she gave us some insight on how dissociation works. But her book, titled Beyond Words, Illness and the Limits of Expression, does so much more. It explores the ways people try to tell stories of their major traumas and illness in a way that breaks down the cliched triumph narrative. That's like stories where everything turns out okay in the end. Her book gets to the core of how storytelling can help but also challenge us in coping and finding paths to healing. Rita Sharon of Columbia University says of the book, "Wielding her ferocious intellect and braving exposure to self and other, Conway makes original discoveries about writing about illness and, more stunningly, about writing and life. It is taut, brave, unequaled in our scholarship, and true." You can find the book published by the University of New Mexico Press at unmpress.com. For now, here's our conversation.
My name is Kathlyn Conway, and I am a psychotherapist and a writer, and I wrote a memoir about my breast cancer that was published in 1997, and then I wrote this book, Beyond Words, which was originally published as Illness and the Limits of Expression. Okay, so that's about it.
That's great. Well, okay. I'm really excited to talk to you today because I've spent quite a bit of time with your book, Beyond Words, and I think it's just really interesting and important work. And I, first of all, thank you for writing it. So what I find interesting about the perspective in the book is that you're coming from a really complex background as being someone who has personally experienced serious illness. You're also a practitioner and a writer. And so that gives you a lot of different angles to sort of take on the experience of illness. And what I'm really interested in as a sort of writer myself is that you take this unique perspective by focusing on storytelling, basically how people tell their own stories about their own illness and what that means. So I'm just curious, what is your relationship with storytelling, and why is narrative such a kind of rich place for you to kind of tell your story from?
Well, I have a background in English literature, so that's sort of a place that I come from originally. But in terms of illness, I came to storytelling in a very personal way. After I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and then I went through 6 months of chemotherapy, and afterwards I thought I would feel better and back to my life, and instead what I found was that I was really depressed. And so someone suggested I try writing, because that's something I had always done in my life. So I just started writing down anything I could remember about the experience, particular incidents, doctor's appointments, chemo, my family. And I found amazingly that I felt much better almost immediately, which sounds a little hokey, but in fact that was the truth. And I just kept writing and eventually published that as a memoir. But the other thing was that while I was sick, I really looked for books that would be helpful in terms of how to handle such a difficult situation. And what I found were books that just seemed very cliched to me, very superficial. They had titles like No Such Thing as a Bad Day, or I'd rather have chemo than clean the garage, why I wore lipstick to my mastectomy. And they just seemed flip and not useful. And I was surprised that there was so little that was really helpful. Then after I wrote my memoir, I did find a number of books that were written by other writers, primarily, I think, because they're used to writing good books. And they were people who either had chronic illness or disability, which was interesting because I think that these were people who had to live with the experience in an ongoing way and had to come to terms with it in the way that someone with an acute illness doesn't exactly have to do. So I started reading those books and found them extremely helpful in terms of their ability to describe what serious illness really feels like, what it does to a person's life, how difficult it really is. They were blunt, they were honest, and I found them helpful and moving, even though they weren't, sort of Pollyanna-ish. And so it was out of that came the second book and it was sort of an attempt to see what the story was of illness. Not that there's a story, but what are the issues that come up for people, the difficult issues, and how do people handle those?
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of your work is sort of coming out of this space of absence. So in your book, you kind of contrast what you call the triumph narrative, which is those stories that you're talking about that you were finding in the beginning, and you contrast that with the kind of more authentic story that you're finding, and those are the stories that you're interested in. So it's coming out of what you sort of couldn't find at first in this canon of kind of popular illness literature.
Absolutely.
So I'm interested that this idea that there doesn't necessarily always have to be this happy ending, this happy ever after, or even a resolution or a story of triumph. In the narratives that you talk about in your book, you get at something more difficult, but also more authentic. And you say this really beautiful thing near the beginning of the book. You say that you feel that these more authentic illness narratives have the potential to, quote, allow us to face the limits of the self and its expression in language. I'm really interested in that statement. I was wondering if you could tell me more about why you're interested in that space of sort of uncertainty, a bit of unknowing, and also just of absence, both in the literature and in the experiences you were finding. And how does illness kind of draw you to those edges, to the limits, to the boundaries?
I mean, I think that ultimately dealing with serious illness is sort of about dealing with our mortality and dealing with our limits. And I think particularly in our culture, that's not something that we're very good at doing. I think it's also that it's an experience that's extremely difficult to talk about. I mean, there's a book by Elaine Scarry, I forgot the title, it's about pain, and she describes how difficult it is to describe pain. And I think that's part of it. Also, Virginia Woolf also has an essay about that. And in her diaries, she tries to explain her own suffering while she's going through depression. And it's very difficult to find words for that. But I think the life issue is that, I think part of the triumph narrative, the problem with the triumph narrative is that it denies limitation. It sort of gives the impression that no matter what is going on, you should be able to overcome it, rise above it, be positive. And I think that the reality is that when you're sick, when your body is affected, it affects yourself. It affects your capacity to be resilient. I always think of the example of if you have the flu and somebody would suggest, well, just go to work and act like everything is fine. That's a sort of nearly impossible thing to do. And yet we have this notion that we should be able to continue as normal no matter what's going on. And I think it's because we can't say, wait, I can't do everything. I can't always function. I can't always look great. I can't always be happy.
So it's interesting. So physical suffering sort of bring us to the limits of what we kind of want to talk about in the human experience, it sounds like. But you also write that one of the fundamental facts about physical suffering and one of its essential characteristics is that it quote, cuts a person off from the outside world and turns them inward. And I was really interested in that process because to me it almost sounds like the opposite of storytelling, which is a sort of outreaching, like a communication to try and connect. And I'm really interested how you draw these kind of two things together. There's almost a tension there between the experience of illness and the experience of telling your story, and yet they seem to have something linked and they seem to be purposeful for each other. I'm wondering if you could talk about that sort of tension between illness and storytelling and how they might serve each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really interesting question. It's true. I think that illness is such an internal experience, and yet storytelling is reaching out. And my thought is that when you're telling the story, it's very hard to describe the sort of internal part. It's very hard to put into words what pain is like, what suffering is like. So I think partly what happens is in storytelling, you don't really describe the internal experience so much, or you try to, but it's really difficult. So you end up describing external things, and then the feeling will emerge from the external thing that you tell. For example, if you're describing getting a diagnosis or you're describing going to chemo, I think that somehow something emerges from that gives a hint of the internal experience, but that it's really hard to describe the internal experience. We just don't have words for it.
Yeah, there's something interesting. Just as you're talking, I was thinking of Kafka, actually, and how, he had to create this sort of disgusting external creature to describe the experience of, right, like loneliness, depression, or alienation. And so that kind of really fits with what you're saying, that we almost have to try and externalize it, but in that process, something sort of gets lost.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So one thing I really want to get at is you talk about one of the most difficult aspects, or at least one of the most difficult to articulate, is this dissolution of the self, which you talk about as being a process that occurs during major trauma or illness. I'm wondering if, even from a maybe even more clinical or diagnostic perspective, if you could just maybe talk a little bit about that process. What is that dissolution of the self or disassociation that you talk about in your book?
Mm-hmm. Again, it's so hard to describe these things. I mean, there are people who try. Andrew Solomon writes about this experience when he goes into this major depression, where interestingly, he describes it in physical terms, even though what he's describing isn't an emotional breakdown. He describes it as losing control of his bowels, just his whole body sort of collapsing. And other people have done the same thing, where I guess it's the same thing. It's sort of externalizing what's this internal feeling of disillusion. Someone described sort of having cancer and sort of just sitting with this terrible feeling that he called the dread that would just come over him, where he couldn't move. He would just sort of stare into space and wait for it to pass. So again, I mean, it's a more external description. I think that the question of dissociation is slightly different. I mean, I think about people who are in either being physically abused, even rape situations, where they describe how they sort of remove themselves from the experience, and they kind of went to the upper corner of the room and were sort of watching themselves. That's an experience where people try to protect themselves by actually removing themselves psychologically from what's going on, because it's so intolerable.
What do you think the purpose or the usefulness of this kind of separation is? Like, do you view this as I think positive and negative is too black and white, but is this sort of a protective healing impulse, or is this a just pure survival instinct, this kind of separation?
I think it's a survival instinct, but you're right, there's this inherent tension between needing to remove yourself because something is just intolerable and yet needing to process it in order to get beyond it. And, there's a lot of discussion in my field, in the field of psychotherapy, about that issue, like, what is best when people are in a traumatic situation, for them to be able to move away from it, or do they need to be dealing with it? And I certainly don't have any answers. But there's a book by Christina Middlebrook. I think it's called Seeing the Crab. And she does something very interesting. She felt when she went through chemo that she basically lost that period of time. It was like losing a portion of her life because she couldn't remember. She was, either sleeping or drugged or whatever. Or she needed to dissociate because it was so terrible. And after she gets better, she feels like she needs to sort of reconstruct that period of time in her life. So she talks to her family and friends about what they remembered about the experience, and they describe how she was and what happened, and she's sort of attempting to put her life back together and to fill in that hole, or to fill in that place where she was sort of absent. I thought that was really interesting because in a way it does both things. She sort of removed herself psychologically, but on the other hand, she then reclaimed herself.
Interesting. So that kind of gives an even more complicated look at this question of sort of splitting off of the self, or I might even call it a bit of self-erasure of parts. And I'm still not sure if those are the same things. You might want to comment on that. I'm not sure if, you sort of made a distinction between dissociation and the kind of dissolution of the self, which might be still different from a bit of self-erasure. I think these might fall on a spectrum. I'm not really sure. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it does fall on a spectrum. I think there's so much variation in ways people handle these things. One other thing, I think it's always interesting for people to be aware of this, which I'm sure you read in the book, which is that when people are injured, they often refer to their body part as the leg. So they'll be talking, they have a broken leg, say. They don't say my leg, they say the leg or the eye, which I think is so interesting because it's like the offending body part has to be disowned. It doesn't even feel like it's you anymore. And maybe that's an attempt to protect themselves from having to integrate this broken part, this damaged part.
You talk about this a bit, where you contrast the difference between sort of linear narratives and circular narratives, because this kind of sounds like a circular thing. You have a trauma, you split off a part of yourself to survive it, but then, as you were saying before, there's this sense of needing to somehow put the pieces back together to go on. And is this where kind of storytelling or narrative comes in for you? Is this where it starts to make sense in the process of illness? The kind of coming back together?
Well, and here again, there's this tension between, on the one hand, wanting very much to represent how chaotic the experience is, how disruptive it is, how damaging. But we don't have a way to replicate that in terms of our storytelling, nor do we necessarily want to be replicating that. I mean, I think we tell stories as a way to get control of what felt so out of control. And I think that storytelling is really powerful in that way. It's like taking sort of what's disorganized, chaotic, what feels like a mess, and giving it some order. So again, then the question is, in giving it that kind of order, do we lose something of the craziness of the experience, the upset of the experience. So I think people who write stories about illness are working always in that tension between getting control of it, but then are you somehow betraying it by presenting a more controlled story.
So as someone who has personally gone through very serious illness in your life more than once, is this something that you find becomes an exercise in strengthening a muscle for you? Do you find that maybe you've gone through this process of having to take part of yourself outside of yourself to survive an immediate situation, and then you process it by your writing and working sort of back into the experience and bringing it outward again? Do you feel that this has exercised a muscle, made something, I don't really want to use the word stronger, but sort of made you open or aware to something that you didn't have before?
Well, maybe it does. Maybe strengthening is actually true. I mean, how do I deal with what I've been through? It's interesting in a way. I deal with it because I now have this story about it, and it really is the way I remember it. I remember the experience just as I wrote about it.
I'm interested in how also our bodies sort of physically remember things, right? So when we're talking about illness, there's a lot of literature, obviously, about the way that body remembers trauma, maybe even differently than the way we intellectually remember it. Is there a piece of that for you in illness, that your body sort of holds memories that you still struggle to articulate, or do you feel like you've told your story the way that you wanted to tell it?
Well, I can go along feeling like I've told my story, particularly when I'm feeling fine. But then if I have any medical issue, if I have a pain or I have something that's worrying me, then I am right back in the sort of worst part of the experience. I mean, that's what trauma is. So, that any kind of physical problem can sort of trigger all of the fear and, all of the fear that something is wrong, something bad is happening. And it's very easy to be thrown back into it, I think, when you have some sort of physical problem that comes up.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that sort of personal side of the experience. I understand the cycle of it from a sort of study standpoint. I do a lot of reading about this, and I've experienced illness through close family members, but I think I really, really appreciate your understanding of where narrative, storytelling, and writing can function here, because what I love about your book is that you're bringing together voices from a whole bunch of sources, and you're filtering them through your personal experience, and that's what makes it powerful, is that there's multiple things here. There is no one way. There is no single story. And that helps us. You definitely get us somewhere with that. And I really appreciate that. And so thank you for your work, and thank you for talking to us today. This has been Hyacinth Podcast, The Interviews, with Dr. Kathlyn Conway. To listen to our regular, curated episodes, visit hyacinthpodcast.com or subscribe on your favorite app. And as always, connect with me at Hyacinth Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where you can leave comments about the episodes and share your own stories. I love to get your feedback. I'm Carmel Michael. Thank you for listening.